are interested in the topics but aren't able to join us during their workday. So thank you for that. We want to thank our funder, the WITH Foundation. They're the ones who made all this information freely available and the free ASHA CEUs to those who are able to attend in person. And just a brief reminder, so for today, we've got a presentation on some best practices and some very good information that's going to be shared with you today about opportunities and resources. Amy is going to be stopping and asking for questions throughout her presentation. So if you can hold any questions either for those points or feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat as well. And then we freely invite you to participate in any discussion portions on cases that are presented or any questions or cases about those in your life. As a brief reminder, we do like to remind people, please close any applications that might be using any additional bandwidth or resources on your computer, just to make sure that you're getting the feed cleanly presented to you. And then if you haven't already, we do have a pre-session survey that we are sending out. We are collecting information on those that are participating in order to look at the best way we can offer this type of information. We will also be offering a post-session survey at the end. So we thank you in advance. As always, these surveys, are completely optional, and you do not need to complete them for CEUs or any other reason, but we do appreciate the feedback. With that being said, I am very excited to introduce Ms. Amy Goldman. She is retired as the co-executive director of the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University, Pennsylvania's University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, where she was also an associate professor in the Department of Psychological, Organizational, and Leadership Studies. Her portfolio included grants from the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council, as well as the Pennsylvania Department of Health, focused on emergency preparedness for people with disabilities. Subsequently, she served as the technical assistance specialist for the Eastern United States for the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for State Assistive Technology Act programs, or AT3, where she continued to focus on building interest and capacity in emergency preparedness for people with disabilities. Amy is currently the president of the U.S. Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, USAC, where she's also active in USAC's Disaster Relief Committee. She's the co-coordinator for the AAC strand for the Assistive Technology Industry Association, as well as its continuing education content consultant. She's the current chair of the Pennsylvania Board of Examiners in Speech Language and Audiology, president of the National Council of State Boards in Speech Language Pathology and Audiology, and past chair of the steering committee of the American Speech Language Hearing Association's Special Interest Group on AAC. So thank you, Amy, very much for being here with us today, and I look forward to hearing your information.
My pleasure, and just give me a moment and I will put up my slides. Okay, so again, you heard about me, and I'm so glad you're here because this is a lifespan concern for you as well as for the people you serve. So just a disclosure, I will be getting an honorarium from ECHO, although it doesn't affect the content. And non-financial, as mentioned, I'm the president of USAC and a member of its Disaster Relief Committee. And an acknowledgement to the other members of our Disaster Relief Committee, as some of the content was developed and utilized in a variety of national and international presentations of the committee. So I guess we couldn't be more timely in scheduling this. You've heard in the news about the damage from Puerto Rico. And I think as of this morning, only 80% of the island has its power restored, and the devastation has been remarkable and terribly unfortunate. These are people who were just recovering from Maria, a short 5 years ago. And if you recall, like right after Maria, there was also an earthquake. And you in Florida, and if anyone's here from Texas, you're familiar with hurricanes, and even on the East Coast, Superstorm Sandy, etc. But the question is, are you ready? September is National Preparedness Month. We know that people with disabilities are much more likely than people without disabilities to be severely affected during disasters. This slide is from the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, which is a cross-disability organization run by people with disabilities. It's a collaboration of many, many different public and private agencies, and they are the go-to people for the go-to resource for people with disabilities affected by disaster. So check them out. Today's objectives. 2 reasons why SLPs should be personally prepared for disasters and emergencies, as well as ways that SLPs can enhance the preparedness of the people they serve. So we will be looking at this image again. This is the disaster management cycle. And it is literally a cycle. You start with preparation, then response after the event, then recovery, and then mitigation, which means taking the steps to avoid an impact of future incidents. And you'll see the list, and this is not a exhaustive list of incidents: hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, floods, tsunami, volcanoes, school shootings and other mass shootings, pandemic, gas leak, chemical spill, power outage, contaminated water supply, etc. So the approach to preparation is called an all hazards approach. Here we have some lovely icons. See if you can guess what the icon stands for. Your challenge in getting personally prepared is to know which hazards are most likely in your area, although not to discount that there may be hazards you don't anticipate that happen. I think it was maybe 10 years ago, or maybe a little longer, that the Northeast experienced an earthquake, not a typical happening. And like 90% of the people did the wrong thing, which is to try to run out of the building, down the steps, get ready to have it collapse right on you. But basic tenet of preparedness is to know what's most likely in your area. You know, when I was doing the listing that was on the previous slide, which is a slide I've used before, I realized, oh, I didn't list pandemic. Well, that certainly has altered the way or added to the hazards that we consider. And the other thing that I hadn't considered before, and we know the people in Detroit and in Mississippi have experienced water contamination emergencies. Basically, if you are waiting for a situation to develop, you are going to lose your ability to change the outcome. So keep that in mind as we address the importance of preparedness. Getting prepared when the radio is already giving you hurricane warnings may be a little late. And of course, some things you won't even get a warning. So be prepared. Better to be prepared than to be sorry. That's another one of my favorite quotes. Lack of preparedness itself is a disaster. And yet we know people with disabilities are less prepared than the general population, and the general population itself ain't so prepared. Of people with disabilities, those with activity limitations and mental health challenges are the most likely to be unprepared. So thinking about our people who use AAC, other risk factors, non-white, less educated, living alone, female, poor, living in an urban area. Again, think about the AAC users that you support and which of these conditions include their characteristics. And this is from 2019, the Government Accountability Office report. As I mentioned before, when you talk about disability, people with communication disabilities are more at risk of injury, segregation, being institutionalized, and death. So, and I don't know if you're familiar with this icon for communication disabilities that originated out of the Canada AAC chapter, and I love it, and we have permission to use it. Again, this, while this presentation includes you, just a reminder, this is who we're talking about. We're talking about people who use AAC, and the importance of preparation. So now's an opportunity for a little poll, because I'm wondering who of you online have survived an emergency or disaster. So please complete the poll. And of course, remember to submit.
Well, thank you to those that are responding. Of those we've oh, it's shifted. Sorry, give me 1 second. It's shifted dramatically. So we are a Florida presentation very clearly. So we've got about 55% so far have checked hurricane, and roughly 25% at excessive heat emergency, 25% at loss of power. Nobody on winter storms, wildfires, or flooding, actually, which I was a little surprised by.
Okay.
And then we did have about 8% of our respondents say they have not personally or themselves or a family member been impacted.
Okay, great. Thank you. I guess I have to close it on my slide. Okay. Yeah, so the only mistake in life is the lesson not learned. So I'm also wondering, and we'll talk about it later also, what lessons did you learn? Actually, if you have a lesson you learned, feel free to put it in the chat. Were you prepared? What step will you take to be more prepared? So, and I'll pause a little later, and if anybody has entered something in the chat, we'll hear that. Okay. So some musings and lessons that USAC's Disaster Relief Committee learned from the 2017-2018 hurricanes. And this is a saying that I came up with. If you want to know what is wrong with the AAC delivery system, just stress it with a hurricane. So what we learned was a general lack of preparedness. We did full court press outreach in Texas to try to find people who had been affected in terms of the loss or damage of their AAC. And what we found was children who could benefit from AAC had not been evaluated for AAC. We found that children who had AAC, that AAC system remained in school. And as a result, when schools closed because of damage from the hurricanes, they were without their AAC. Then we found out that parents didn't know what AAC their child uses. They didn't know the model, the vendor, the brand. They didn't know anything about the system. Interestingly, but I guess not unexpectedly, we learned that the parents of kids with autism were pretty connected to resources for recovery, including replacement for AAC. And on the other hand, we learned that adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities were least likely to be connected to resources for recovery. And we found that there were post-disaster shortages of service providers. If you recall, during those 2017, 2018 hurricanes, many providers moved either permanently or temporarily. So much so that service providers in the home states were decreased. Okay, a little fussy here. So what does this have to do with us? Hopefully you are in this webinar because you already have an inkling that it has to do with us. So first and foremost, though, you may be the only provider who has the opportunity to discuss preparedness with the person you're serving. Maybe their teachers aren't, maybe their doctors aren't, although I think it should be part of the medical intake process. But clearly, if we look closely at our ASHA Code of Ethics, and probably if you're licensed in your state, some of these are mirrored in your state Code of Ethics, hold paramount the welfare of the persons you serve. Clearly, helping them be prepared fits principle 1. That they have a responsibility to be at the highest level of professional competence and performance. That means, and thank you for attending, that you should have skills and competence in the area of emergency preparedness for the people you serve. And that you have a responsibility to the public for helping to advocate for the unmet communication needs, which may be great in a post-emergency or disaster situation. Clearly, if you are not prepared, you cannot help others. So While this information is mostly focused on helping your clients, you can take away much of the information and apply it to yourself. So you need to have a personal preparedness plan for you and your family. You need to have a plan for communicating with your clients and remote access to records. Now, interestingly, some of you may have learned that lesson through the pandemic. I mentioned before, we want an all hazards approach to planning. You should have a continuity of operations plan or a COOP so that operations can resume. So if you're in higher ed, your university has a COOP. Find out what it is. If you're in a nonprofit agency, hopefully there's a COOP. If you're in a school, hopefully there's a COOP. If you're in private practice, your COOP should include business continuity planning. How can you stay in business when faced with an emergency or disaster? There's lots of resources. So the image is one from FEMA, a continuity guidance circular, and it has a lot of templates in it that you could use. Again, the purpose of COOP is to provide guidance for the agency so that you can continue to operate. Again, post-pandemic, I would venture that most businesses, private, public, education, higher ed, have a COOP, and that it includes, for example, remote operations from alternate work sites. So, personal preparedness. Have a go kit. We'll talk a little bit about go kits, but have one at work, at home, and in your car. So here's another little survey. Do you have a go kit? And for what environment? Home, work, or in the car? And do you have a stay kit or a kit for sheltering in place? So take a few minutes.
So everybody that's responded has a kit for home, and about 29% each for work in the car. And in terms of a stay kit, we're at about 43% for a yes and 57% for a no.
Okay, now I think it's skewed because many of your participants are from Florida. But congratulations. You know, the car go kit is also important for places subject to winter storms. And those supplies will look a little bit different. Okay, so that's great. I know a lot of people have a go kit at home and aren't thinking about the emergency that could happen at work. I think there are workplaces that don't think about the shelter in place that might be needed in the workplace, like a water supply in the workplace. So something to think about. So you need to know what to do if you're not at home when the emergency or disaster strikes. Need to have the communication plan Again, this is personal with your family and other key relationships. Again, know your employer's plan for evacuation or sheltering in place. And if you see AAC users who use wheelchairs in your workplace, know how to evacuate with them or shelter in place with them. Or, for example, if you're in an earthquake prone area, know how to help somebody in a wheelchair shelter in the event of a earthquake. And some of those steps also would apply to tornadoes. So know what you should be doing to help. Okay, go kits and stay bags. Again, there are many, many, many resources online. Ready.gov is the preparedness site for the put up by the federal government. And again, there's wonderful, wonderful resources there. I came across the 5 Ps, which I think is a helpful way to remember what goes in your go kit. People, the things you need for the people. Pills, which can be challenging because there's often no way that your insurance company will pay for anything beyond a supply for you to take every day. Nothing extra, but you need to remember to take your pills with you. Papers, copies of important documents. Paper may include paper money, which you should try not to pilfer when you're short on cash. In part because, and I know a friend of mine who was affected by Hurricane Sandy, that there was no way you could get to an ATM if you needed cash. And credit card machines weren't working. So if you could even get to a gas station that could pump gas, they were only cash. So also your important papers, and particularly if your house may be significantly damaged by fire or flood, particularly wildfires, because they happen so quickly. Make sure you have copies of your insurance papers, records, etc. Pets, have items in your go kit for your pet / service animal, and photos. So the good thing is that nowadays we can store much in the way of photos and papers in the cloud. We encourage you to do that. Photos of your valuables, for example. So go kits and stay bags. Okay, so what can you do as a provider? Help your students, your clients, and their families. So talk with families of people you serve. This is definitely within our scope. Remember the slide about ethics. Have the conversation with the adults that you serve. Develop a unit on emergencies and disasters for transitioning students. So I don't know how many of you work with transition age students. They're going to be adults, right? Being prepared is an adult characteristic. We'll talk a little bit more also about vocabulary. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. but check that vocabulary is available within the AAC system so that the user can be a full participant in discussions related to emergency and disaster. And many of our systems now do include some specialized vocabulary. And many of the icon systems have comprehensive systems, icons related to emergencies and disasters. And some of them, like I know Lesson Picks, if there's a vocabulary word that you cannot find an image for, they will draw one and create one. So again, there's wonderful materials that already exist. One of those is from the American Red Cross Pillowcase Project that has all the materials you would need for a lesson. Okay. So, and again, we'll talk more about preparing people with disabilities, but preparing the people who may interact and need to communicate with our AAC users is extremely important. So one of the roles you can take is to train first responders and emergency personnel in how to communicate with people who have limited speech. So I've given you some resources here. There's two videos, two excellent videos. The second video is done by Mankey and Rang. And this is something that they've written about, they've presented about. I think they're doing a presentation at ASHA and at Closing the Gap about their initiative, which is AAC 101 for first responders. There are tips on educating first responders at the, I think that's the older AAC RERC site archived. And DHS, the Federal Department of Homeland Security, also has a publication, although it's so interesting when Homeland Security and FEMA think about effective communicating, their focus tends to be deaf and hard of hearing. So we are definitely bringing a new slant on communication when we address communication with people who use AAC. And I'm going to talk a little later about if this excites you, the idea of doing this. USAC actually has a grant program that you could access to get some funds to support initiatives in this regard. More about that later. So here's an example. I have two slides that are tips for emergency personnel. They're probably great tips for hospital personnel as well, but certainly could be in a Go kit. So you could take these hints and put them on a sheet for your AAC user and personalize it. So it says, take time to listen to me carefully, or it may take extra time for you to listen to me. I may need extra time to respond. Please confirm that you've understood. I say yes by blank. I say no by blank. Ask me yes, no questions. And I'm sure you all know that it takes a little bit of practice not to ask compound questions like, did you take your meds and are they in the backpack? That's not a yes, no question. That's two questions. Another way you could personalize that is, I can show you what I want by pointing. So again, tips for emergency personnel. Want to tell you just a little story. As mentioned in the introduction, we had some grant funding from the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council to train first responders. And one of the highest impact things we did was we had a full day training, and we had people with disabilities in one room getting like an emergency preparedness 101. And we had first responders in another room getting a disability 101. We brought them together for lunch. The bottom line was we could have skipped everything else and just had them come together for lunch. Many of the first responders had never had an opportunity to interact with people with disabilities. And that was the most powerful takeaway that they indicated on their evaluation, that having met Robert, who used a communication board, and having met Sandra, who used a speech generating device, now when they think about responding, they have Robert and Sandra in mind. So unfortunately, it's hard to get funding to just have a joint meal, but it was very impactful. So here's our disaster management cycle, and we're going to do a little deeper dive into preparation. So it's the hottest day of the year, and they have us doing our snow day drill. That's because if we don't practice before it snows, we won't be ready when it does. And I know you guys probably don't get snow, but you might get ice. I know friends of mine in Georgia Georgia was a mess because of ice storms. So, but the bottom line is you have to prepare before the crisis so that you know what to do in the crisis. So for our people who use AAC, we want to make sure they have an emergency readiness plan. And this is just a page from a Pennsylvania emergency plan that we developed. And this is a joint activity that you fill out the plan together with the person who uses AAC and their family. And in the resources, there's a link to this. But again, there are lots of emergency readiness plans online. Just look for them. So you want to make sure that you have a plan for evacuating or sheltering in place. And I've underlined those words because they may be unfamiliar terms to the people that you're serving. So again, this is for consumers. Plan how you will evacuate with all of your AT and your AAC. Plan on what you will do if you cannot evacuate with your AT and your AAC, if you need to leave it behind. And I know, if there's a rubber boat coming down your flooded street trying to get you out of your second-story window, they may not be able to take your power chair. They may only be able to take you and nothing else. So you have to plan how will you communicate? And if need be, how will you replace your device? Again, we talked about go kits and go bags. And another issue, particularly for people with disabilities who live alone, they live independently, and or they live with support providers. What happens if that individual cannot be with you? Those are all things to be considered in the plan. So here is a checklist for people who have limited speech, and again, can be part of the planning process. So we do have this on the USAC link to emergency on the USAC page, USAC, USSAAC.org. You'll see there's a drop-down menu for disasters resources. Again, do you have your health information with you? Are you prepared at home if you need to stay at home or if you need to stay at work? And again, I talked before about, do you have enough of your medication for 7 days? This might be a challenge to store medication at work again. But hopefully you know what medication you take, and you could, in an emergency or disaster, even if you're in a shelter, you could know what to request. So again, you could download this to use in discussions with your AAC user about what goes in the go bag. So personal information, paper communication displays, non-perishable food, medication, medical supplies, if there's a service dog, pet food, water, change of clothes, radio, batteries, flashlight, and more. So your AAC AT specific content in your bag should include a copy of a low-tech board that's updated periodically and perhaps should be laminated. An emergency disaster specific board that might have some specific vocabulary, and we'll talk about those in the resources. If you can print out your SGD displays, and again, perhaps you want to consider durability, put it in a binder, or somehow make sure it's durable and current. If you have recently, or in the last maybe 5 years, replaced your SGD and your old SGD was still operating, keep it charged and put that in your Go kit. Make sure you have a spare charger if you can afford it. There might be a cost issue, and cables to keep in your kit, spare batteries, and a solar charger if your item can accommodate rechargeable batteries. And actually, one of the things that USAC did a couple of years ago was we gave a dozen solar chargers to the USAID at the Virgin Islands for their disaster preparedness. Special items for go bags. This was a great resource I found. Resources, it's sort of culled from multiple sources, particularly for individuals with autism. So things to help keep calm and quiet, some of the basic needs, visual supports, social stories, visual schedules, and I particularly thought this one was interesting. Items with familiar smells or textures, even down to shampoos, for example, that might give comfort in an extraordinary circumstance. Other actions to take. So one of the images that stuck with me from Katrina was after they evacuated all these people by air, and there in the airport were maybe hundreds of power chairs that had to be abandoned because they couldn't get them on the airplane. If the chair was not labeled, what do you think the odds were of that pretty expensive power chair being reunited with its owner? So everyone who uses any kind of assistive technology, we recommend that you have it labeled with your name and phone number, and possibly an emergency phone number, the contact for somebody who lives outside of the area likely to be affected by the same disaster that you're affected by. Again, think about the cloud, storing information about the SGD, the app, your ID, your model number, any specs about the SGD, store it remotely, again, the cloud or with somebody in your friends and family circle, as well as hard copies of those in your Go kit. Register your AT. Many vendors, if they have some proof that you purchased the original item and you can show that it was lost in an emergency or disaster, they very well may replace it for you at no extra cost. So important to register. Keep a compatible charger for each item in your Go kit. And this goes for all of us. Keep your devices as fully charged throughout the day as possible. Preparedness takes practice. So drill and practice. And I know in this day and age, there are drills for active shooter, unfortunately, and they are practiced. I don't know if they're practiced at the same frequency as fire drills, but we know that drills can get people used to what will happen when the real thing happens. So here's a challenge. This is something that my colleague who teaches at a school for kids with physical disabilities in Mexico brought home. Can you release your kids from their wheelchairs or adaptive seating in the dark, by the way, in case you lose power, and carry them to evacuate? I thought that was a great tip. I know I've sometimes had trouble releasing with full vision available with all the straps and Velcro and buckles and stuff. Store backup communication boards for each student in a go bag by the door. So you could literally grab and go. Have emergency tags for each student with identifying information. Again, so that you grab it, put it on the student as you exit the door. And of course, having the tag have personal information about the student, and perhaps the flip side, having some emergency communication vocabulary. And in the picture, you see a young man who's wearing one of those emergency tags. Catch up with my notes. Core and fringe vocabulary. And vocabulary related to emergency preparedness, emergencies and disasters might be totally unfamiliar to your user. We did a study, and some of our subjects were individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I remember we asked, we were trying to assess the knowledge of emergency. And we said, can you give us an example of an emergency? And one young woman said, if we run out of ice cream. So clearly, some of the terms may be new. Some of them are technical even to us. Do you know the difference between a storm warning or a storm watch? You want to do this in collaboration with your AAC user to talk about the hazards that may be regional. You want to select icons that are meaningful. And this is an important tip also. If you're going to supply an emergency board, emergency communication board, even your users who spell might find stored vocabulary helpful when you're in a charged environment situation like an emergency or disaster. It may be much more difficult to spell. And again, it is better to know and have access to disaster vocabulary and not need it than to not have it and need it. So for some consumers, it may be very helpful to have not just vocabulary, but to develop social stories for getting ready. So moving into response. Well, you know what? Yeah. Did I skip one? All right, I will entertain questions at this point. Do we have any backlog of questions or comments before we move from preparation to response?
Amy, one of the first questions that came in was a logistics question embedded in the comment. It said, where can I get a copy of the slides? This information is great. So I promised to ask if you would be willing to share a handout or a copy of your presentation today.
Absolutely. And you guys can send it out, but maybe we'll only send it to people who complete the evaluation.
That's a nice offer, but I think the IRB would not be pleased with me.
But sure.
Thank you.
This information must get out. Must.
Yes. So to our participants, we will be circulating a newsletter post training. And so if Amy's happy to share her resources with us in terms of a handout or slides, we'll add that to the newsletter as well.
Anything else I need to attend to now before we go on to response?
Amy, I have a question. When you were working on the training that you did for the first responders, did you develop the itinerary in conjunction with them, meaning, discussing with them what their responses were and looking at those gaps?
We did have a consumer advisory group who was helping us develop the training.
Mm-hmm.
So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, our DD council requires it. I mean, it's good practice, but it's actually was a part of the grant.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving right along. Okay, so shelter in place when you are advised to. Your stay kit should have supplies for everybody for as many as 72 hours. And again, there needs to be a plan for communication. It's not too soon to be thinking about what holiday gifts can I give the people who have everything? So a great gift is an emergency radio that's also a hand crank power generator. So I know a colleague of mine 1 year for the holidays gave everybody like emergency related items. Not sure how they appreciated it, but they would if there was an emergency or disaster for sure. Again, evacuate when advised. You know, if there's an emergency or disaster, when there is warning, first of all, be among the first to evacuate when they're beginning to advise people to evacuate. A friend of mine decided like on the second day when Maria was coming to Florida to come up to New Jersey. And she said the roads were packed. And the day after that, they were even more packed. So at the first notice of, you know, this is coming, maybe you want to evacuate. Again, if you have notice, you want to head towards friends and family who live outside of the affected area, or if there are shelters open and that's your maybe only option, evacuate to a shelter. Then for our people who, in addition to using AAC, may have mobility issues, think about if you will need accessible transportation to evacuate, which can be challenging. A friend of mine in Texas has an accessible van. Unfortunately, it was in the shop when the hurricane was coming. So think about a plan and a backup plan. If you're going to be evacuating to remote friends and family, make sure that they are prepared to receive you. So for example, will they have the supplies that they need to support you, the supplies and information? So that's called pre-staging. So think about if they've got space to, for example, keep, if you're a power chair user, but you have a spare manual chair, maybe you want to keep one at the home of the friends/family where you might evacuate to. Shelters. And this is the lingo for this is mass care. And it is a mass of people that can be noisy, very crowded, may not be accessible. So if you look in the image, the cots are like what, 3 inches above the ground. I could not get up off of one. Although nowadays, I think when they are replacing cots, they are trying to replace them with higher cots. So if you, and I'm speaking to the AAC user, have physical needs, you might end up getting diverted to a special needs shelter. Although more and more there are efforts by advocates, by the Red Cross, to make sure that all shelters are inclusive. But if there is diversion to special needs shelter, it may mean that you, the AAC user, end up separated from your family members or your other supports. So social stories for after the disaster. It's too noisy. Again, there's going to be a lot that people need to talk about. So let's make sure that they have the vocabulary to use. Okay. Recovery. Recovery can take a long time. You may end up with families that might be in temporary housing. And this is a story from one of the families that USAC helped after Hurricane Harvey. And you see they lived in a hotel, the whole family in one hotel room for 8 months. And again, when we think about our AAC users, remember that we will be looking at vocabulary for before, during, and after. So teach and have access to specialized vocabulary, having opportunities to talk about feelings. Everybody affected needs support. People are more important than things. That can be a hard thing to appreciate. But also know that recovery takes time. And I mentioned my friends in Puerto Rico and the disasters one after another that they've been affected by. And I was visiting a friend of mine in Puerto Rico about 3 years ago. Again, it was a couple of years after Maria. And she said, every time there's rain, people are traumatized. You can only imagine how they are now. And on the news, they've had some interviews with people in Puerto Rico who lived through Maria and now are living through Fiona. And they're just in shock. You know, maybe they rebuilt after Maria and now here they are again. So, and if you've ever tried to find a mental health professional to deal with somebody who uses AAC or has other disabilities, it can be a challenge to get people with AAC the mental health counseling they need, never mind that they need to have the vocabulary to express their needs. So, you know, again, the human cost of these disasters and living through a disaster or an emergency. So USAC can help. An important email, disasterrelief@usac.org, and the specific link on our USAC website, usac.org/relief-recovery. So one of the ways that we can help is by replacing AAC that has been lost, by providing short-term services to AAC users. We can help identify loaners, and I encourage you all to connect with your state assistive technology program, which you can find at at3.net/state programs. And you can look up your state's Assistive Technology Act program, and they may have both a lending library and or a reuse program where they might have some gently used AAC that they could distribute. Going to spend a little bit of time on school-based disasters because these are in the news, unfortunately. Again, Some of this we've covered before, but specifically, we need to make sure that the preparedness activities include issues like active shooters. Some of the visual support tools that might be helpful. I encourage you as an SLP, if you work in the schools, review your school plans. Keep in mind that you may be in various locations in the building or in multiple buildings, so you'll need to know the plans for those environments. Again, review the general school plan to see if it needs any modification to accommodate your students who use AAC and your students who are in wheelchairs. Social narratives, again, a way to prepare your students. Reasons for the lockdown drill, all things to help students understand and hopefully without traumatizing them in the very preparation. So make a plan and practice a plan. Learn about and participate in emergency planning efforts and encourage your AAC users who are adults or young adults to connect with the Centers for Independent Living in their community. Many of the Centers for Independent Living, or CILs, are engaged in emergency planning efforts, and you can learn about those through the CILs, and they'll often be able to tell you when there's an emergency drill that's going to be happening in your community. And it is much more helpful for emergency personnel to have a real person in a wheelchair with a spinal cord injury who uses AAC than an actor who's not disabled, who's sitting in a wheelchair. It's a different experience. People who use AAC should identify themselves to first responders and emergency personnel before an emergency or disaster. Sign up for emergency alerts. Now, there are things called registries, but they're a little bit controversial in that, number one, just because you're signed up for a registry doesn't mean you're going to be the first person they go help. And sometimes people have the misconception that that is actually what a registry will do for them. The other thing is when people register and then their phone changes or their email changes or they move, and then the registry isn't any way, shape, or form helpful. And there are more and more smartphone apps that can help in an emergency or disaster. And one of the things that people should have is ICE in case of emergency. So again, as a provider, you need to be prepared, help your clients prepare. Same thing, engage in emergency planning efforts in your community. Be a volunteer, train first responders and emergency personnel. And you yourself sign up for emergency alerts. Okay, a little bit about USAC disaster relief grants. So we offer grants for these purposes: to build your own knowledge and capacity in the area of emergency preparedness. We support activities that restore AAC capacity in a region affected by disaster. Our grants can be used to support personal preparedness training for people with complex communication needs. It can be used for AAC 101 training for people in the emergency management system. You have to be a USAC member to apply for a grant. However, if you're a USAC member in higher ed, you can apply on behalf of your students. We will also support USAC members who are disaster survivors. Grants may be given to individuals who use AAC and their families who have received services from USAC. And actually, one of the things we do is provide membership in USAC to those AAC users and families. The grants are for up to $1,000. And to apply, this application form, or for more information, contact disasterrelief@usac.org. So we did have just examples. The Bridge School actually went to Louisiana and did training there. Marissa Rang and Sharon Menke are doing sessions, as I mentioned, at ASHA and at Closing the Gap. And they applied for some funds to offset some of their travel to those instances where they can disseminate this very important information. Okay, we have a few minutes to talk about some composite cases drawn from real life, but any resemblance to people, actual people, is accidental. So Carla is a girl with CP. Her speech is very difficult to understand. She was using a low-tech system. Now she's using an iPad with an app. And her IEP is silent, actually, on her taking the district supplied iPad home. And by the way, the communication book didn't go home either. And on March 16, 2020, her school was shut due to the pandemic and then was closed for the remainder of the school year. And by early April, virtual instruction began in the district, and it lasted through the spring 2021. So, for your consideration, what's wrong with this situation? How could the SLP respond to this situation? And how could future situations like this be prevented? So, brave ones, if you want to raise your hand and communicate verbally, we'll recognize you, or you can respond in the chat.
I'm going to do a quick shameless plug for FAST here in Florida. I know when we had some people reach out to us with very similar situations, FAST worked really hard to ship equipment. I know we were meeting people outside in parking lots, bringing things to cars so they wouldn't have to come in. And then many of the centers increased their services via Zoom. So for the families that needed the additional support because they were having to facilitate learning for the first time, in the case of someone school age, and in medical situations as well, we tried to reach out to support those people via Zoom so that they didn't feel like they had to come in. So I'm sure other state Tech Act programs were doing similar activities, but I know that's what we here in Florida we're trying to do to kind of pinch hit in this situation.
Do we have any other responses? How could future situations like this be prevented?
Hi.
Hi.
I wasn't sure if I was supposed to digitally raise my hand, and so I just
That's,
unmuted myself.
that's okay. Do it.
Um, it it so the child had an iPad that didn't go home, and they didn't have any form of communication in the house. Like they didn't have a low-tech backup. If they couldn't send the iPad home, I don't know, it seems like it would be good practice to make a low-tech backup of the whole system. I mean, if they're not using it at home, it seems like a very lost opportunity.
Exactly. So what could be done to prevent that from happening?
Well, good practice from the beginning of making sure that the school is coordinating with the family, and that not only is there a backup at the school, but there's things at the home, like a complementary system at the home to be able to carry over the learning into the home environment, make sure the family understands and uses the system so that we get better carryover, and then they're ready for disasters as well.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you, Alana. Carolyn, were there any
Thank you.
others who weighed in on that?
Not in the chat. If anyone else has anything that they observed or think would be helpful in the future, please let us know.
Okay, well, definitely we need to talk about taking technology home and modifying the IEP so that there is technology either going home or at home. So yeah, that's probably something that may require a systemic change. I am familiar with districts that will not let technology go home, which is a violation of the I in individualized, that there cannot legally be a blanket policy about technology not going home. So that's definitely something that needs to be addressed. Okay. Here's Dennis. He has intellectual and developmental disabilities. He primarily is an unaided communicator with idiosyncratic gestures, ASL signs and sign approximations, and verbal approximations. He lives in a group home, and he and other residents get consultative SLP services once a month. And now the flood has come, and his home was evacuated to an emergency shelter. However, on that day, the direct support professional, who is his most familiar and skilled communication partner, was not on duty. What's wrong with this scenario? What do you think could happen to Dennis? And how could future situations like this be prevented?
I'm going to go ahead and volunteer that having only one trained staff member or partner is asking for situations like this to happen. So additional training, certainly.
Right. And, you know, some of the, as a result in part of some of the additional education that first responders and shelters have gotten, some of them might have a basic communication board. But if Dennis has never been introduced to pointing to symbols as a way to communicate, it's not going to work. So maybe teaching Dennis about that might be helpful. Another thing that we sometimes have done is personal communication dictionaries. And it's very easy now with our phones to take pictures and video. When Dennis does this, it means this. When Dennis says this, it means this. And that could go in a go bag for Dennis. So any other ideas or comments coming in?
Not
I
in
had a related question.
Okay.
Are there already made like a bracelet or something that would not necessarily be like a sensory triggering thing for people with sensory sensitivities that could have, sort of like the bracelets that they used to make out of metal that would go on a chain and be like, that my name is this is my blood type, my mom's name is such and such, like an ID bracelet, but specifically that you could order that it has like, I use lamp, words for life, or I use blah blah blah, like I have a communication disorder, but like something that would be comfortable for somebody with sensory
Yeah,
issues.
not that I know of, but if you're creative and you know Etsy, make a version of a medical alert bracelet. Yeah, that's possible, but none that I know of. However,
Okay.
and thank you for participating. However, the next set of slides are resources. Well, I'm going to skip tell us your stories and skip to the resources. Brand new article. This is open access. And I tried to copy the link and it just does this, but it's in the I can send it to Carolyn. It's in the perspectives, the most recent perspectives, and it is an open article. So even if you're not an ASHA member, you can get it and download it. And it's also, I also have the link, follow USAC on Facebook, and it's linked there. But the article talks about USAC's text-based toolkit, which is a strategy, a training strategy, where you get a text one a day, or I think you can alter it to be one a week, that gives you steps to take for emergency readiness. So for example, text one is, are you signed up for emergency alerts? And it explains about emergency alerts. Day two or week two, your text describes the health and safety and the need for a communication passport and a personal emergency profile. Day three are sample communication boards. Day four is go bag. Day five is emergency checklist and plan. Day six is practice your plan. And day seven is congratulations. So anybody can sign up for that program, learn more about it in the article. Okay, here's a whole bunch of other resources for you. Again, personal stories from Pam Kennedy, who almost died in flooding. A whole bunch of annotated links, and all of these links have been checked, so they should work for you. Some other tools, and I don't mind if you send out the actual PowerPoint rather than a PDF, so that they can get the links, clickable links.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate that.
More resources, more. I'm telling you, there's tons of them. We but have to recognize the importance of the topic, find the resources and use them. Yeah, we have the archived USAC webinar by Mankey and Rang for the AAC 101. And I hope that well, we're like out of time, but think about when you go back to your office, what will you do that you learned about today to improve your own readiness? And join USAC. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Amy. We appreciate your time and your expertise and everything you shared us. And we truly appreciate you allowing us to send out the PowerPoint. So we will attach that in that raw version, so you'll have access to all of those incredible links that she shared with us today, and all those really valuable resources. Just a quick plug for the post-session survey. So this is separate from the one we sent before, and really looking at feedback on the content and the presentation that was given today. We just dropped that link in the chat as well. So we thank anyone for their time and willingness to participate as we collect some data on the series. As a couple of brief reminders, we are meeting next week, September 28th at 12:00 p.m. One of our own faculty members here at UCF is presenting on AAC assessment, commitment to storms. We're very much looking forward to that presentation. If you do have a specific case for her that you would like to have the group discuss, or example cases that you come across related to AAC assessment, please feel free to submit that through the link in the chat. And then we do have our general ECHO website up and running with all of these links shared there if you haven't visited already. As a brief reminder, you're going to be getting the the CEU form from us. Please complete it, send it back. You only need to complete that form one time, no matter how many sessions you visit. And we are only able to offer CEUs for sessions that you attend live. So we certainly would appreciate and welcome you to share the recorded sessions with any colleagues who couldn't be here today, just to let them know, unfortunately, we cannot offer CEUs after today's session. And finally, here's all of our contact information, including Amy's, who generously said she would respond to any follow-up questions that you all may have. Thank you again to everybody who was able to be here today, and we hope to see some of you all with us next week. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.